Hello and welcome to the Sydney Opera House, where we're sitting in the Jones Sutherland Theatre in a big empty space, responsibly distanced, but all on our own. It's really good to be here, bringing you the third in our series of Thinking Through a Crisis, where we're talking about responses to COVID-19 and the way that we're dealing with all of that. And we are, of course, on Gadigal country. This land was never ceded, and the results of the dispossession of this land are still being felt today. So First Nations people watching today, welcome to the conversation. It's good to have you with us. So we're here today to talk about ethics. And when we first started thinking about this conversation, we were thinking about it at the moment. We're coming out of lockdown, various restrictions are being eased, people are feeling a little bit freer, but we are still in a global pandemic. But we wanted to sort of talk about the ways that the crisis has influenced the way we behave, the choices that we make about the way we live, the way we relate to each other, our ideas around responsibility and community. And we will be absolutely talking about these things today, but in the last week, the video of George Floyd being murdered in Minneapolis has sparked riots and protests around the world and has really highlighted the deep and systemic inequality that exists in the United States and also in Australia, where there are protests also. And I think that COVID has really amplified inequality. I think that it's amplified a lot of things, and I think that inequality is a really, really massive part of that. So I do think that the two things aren't not linked. So we're talking about ethics, but not just about COVID, also about racism. And with me today are two people extremely well qualified to be discussing these matters. Brigid Delaney is a writer and journalist. You can read her columns in The Guardian, or you can read her books, Wellmania, The Restless Life and Wild Things. And she's currently co-authoring a book about Stoicism. Dr Monty Badami is an anthropologist, writer and podcast host who studies religion, ritual, inequality, identity and community, and is currently working on developing inclusive and respectful COVID responses in remote Indigenous communities. So welcome both of you. I'm really glad you can be here today, and you're going to have to imagine the wild applause that greeted that introduction.
Thank you, Edwina.
What a pleasure.
So one of the things from an ethical point of view that I've been fascinated with over this whole period of COVID and lockdown and all of the rules that we've had to adhere to during this time has been this tension between the individual and the collective, and the way that sort of journey has changed and shifted in the last 400 years since we've been in lockdown. What do you think? Is there a difference between individual and collective when it comes to ethics? And how do you think they've played out in our response to this crisis?
I mean, each individual, comprises of a collective. So whatever I do as an individual, affects my community. So, for example, if I decide that I don't want to socially distance or sanitize my hands, or if I go out and I'm sick, my individual actions, affect a collective. And it also sends a message to my community that it's okay to breach guidelines, or it's okay to just do your own thing. So therefore, the message about social distancing can break down really easily if individuals take things into their own hands. So the collective has been incredibly important and probably crucial in the management of the pandemic.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. I think without that collective response, we wouldn't have had the success that we've seen certainly in Australia. And we're seeing how in other countries, the absence of that collective response has resulted in quite catastrophic outcomes. And so, it is a collective response, but we all have this responsibility to act as individuals. And I suppose, in that sense, there is a difference between the self and the collective. But I wonder, can we understand the self without situating that self, that individual, within a broader collective understanding of how we've evolved, how we've emerged, the sorts of things that affected our level of privilege and our ability to act in the moment of crisis.
I mean, I guess the self doesn't exist without the community that is supporting the self. But there have been, I think hoarding at the beginning was a really interesting little kind of moment where people were like, well, I have to look after myself and my family, and so I need a room full of toilet paper because otherwise I can't possibly feel secure. I mean, what does Stoicism tell us about that, Brigid?
So hoarding of toilet paper in the Stoic world is very bad. Stoicism is an ancient Greek and Roman philosophy. It's developed in pre-Christian times, but it's still very relevant today because proponents of Stoicism or Stoic teachers like Epictetus, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, they believed that the individual was responsible for their own thoughts, actions, character and judgment, but the collective had to be considered in relation to those things. So there's this dichotomy of control which Epictetus talks about, which is I can't control what you think or what you do. If you want to go out and buy 100 rolls of toilet paper, that's your decision. But I can control my fear response. And so a lot of the hoarding was a fear response. So if I control my own fear, I might then be a good role model for other people in the community to understand that they don't need to hoard, that there is enough to go around. Because if everyone acts from fear, then reason isn't used as the kind of primary motivator in judgment.
Mm. Is that possible, though? When people are staring down the faces of a pandemic, panic does seem like not an irrational response.
I think that's where the political leaders are really important. Like having, there was largely, like I'm from Victoria, a very good response to Daniel Andrews, leadership at the start because it was strong, it was clear. I think probably the same with Brigid Delaney, and there was a sense of someone's in charge. This is what they've shut down this event. They've told us we can do this, this, and this. And there's no room for ambiguity. Whereas I think in America, when you had governors, doing things that in other states they weren't doing, and Trump didn't have a response, that lack of leadership created a lack of collective.
Mm. Mm. So Monty, you were saying that in Australia we've had quite a good outcome as a result of all of this. But what do you think that responses to the pandemic and to the restrictions that may or may not have been placed, and when I say responses, I mean not just responses by citizens, but also by governments. What do you think that says about cultures? Do you think there's something to be read into or learned about different cultures based on the way that they responded to this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's no better place to start than looking at our own culture. I think it's really important to recognise that, the responsibility of disease transmission was placed squarely on the shoulders of individuals, but individuals were not all equally affected by the transmission of the disease. We know that it affects communities and particular groups differently. Disproportionately, inequitably. And we see that in the statistics. We see that particular communities are going to be affected more than others. And so, whilst the responsibility of stemming the transmission has been placed on individuals, of course it needs to be shared with the government. Of course it needs to be shared with the collective and the community. I don't know that choice and agency is equally distributed within a cultural milieu. And so this is where something like the pandemic, something that has affected us all and that has placed us all in this kind of existential crisis, right, where we're going to go, what the heck is going on? It forces us to take a look at ourselves and say, well, actually, is the way that we're doing things okay? What are the problems? What has been brought to the surface? We know that our privilege has made us blind to the fact that the distribution of resources around healthcare and access to healthcare and things like protective equipment hasn't been equally distributed. So what does that tell us and what can we learn from it?
But even just our experiences of isolation has been really, really to do with, whether you've got a house to live in. Like my experience getting takeaway food delivered to my door is different from the person who's cycling that takeaway food to my door. Like there are all of these kind of things that are playing out. Just to keep on this idea of what it reveals around cultures, what do you think it says about being Australian, or what do you think Australia's response has said about us in terms of our compliance or our lack of compliance? We're a relatively privileged country, but that privilege is distributed unequally.
Yeah, I think Australia has, by and large been quite obedient. There have been a number of fines, and some early work has been done to show that the fines have been in kind of lower socioeconomic areas. And there'll be still more work to be done in that. But look, Australians, I think a couple of things have happened. One, JobKeeper, which meant that it felt like no one was going to starve to death because of the pandemic, and that there would be a relatively stable workforce coming out of this because the jobs weren't lost. And that shocked me coming from a Liberal government. I thought, I can't believe it feels like an extremely socialist kind of universal basic income style policy. Plus you had you had New Start increased, and you had all these kind of huge social changes that would have taken probably 30 or 40 years to get there. And I reckon it almost felt like one afternoon in March, the entire world changed. And it has shown us that we are capable of creating very massive and rapid social and equitable change from a conservative base, and have the population support it and go along with it and say, we're okay to be in a deficit if it means that, people in my community who might have worked in a pub have a similar income. So I felt quite optimistic, not just about Australia's response, but also about the government's response. And then the possibility that in the future, we can kind of pivot and act quite quickly to make positive changes.
Yeah, look, I'm incredibly proud of many responses. I think there's a lot that we can do differently and a lot we can do better. But definitely, I think that with the risk of dropping a dodgy pun, I mean, we can't look at isolation in isolation either, right? The COVID isolation came off the back of floods and fires and drought. And so Australia does have a history of getting stuck in and supporting each other and having that collective way of dealing with things. This is what does make us so very, very different from America in that respect. That concept of egalitarianism, mateship, supporting the community and doing what we need to do to survive is a big part of our culture. It's very important. By the same token, Australia had the highest rates of panic buying in the world. Yeah. Right? So, I again, it's this problem I have with looking at it as either or from that binary perspective, and starting to allow the complexity to sit. So, or sit with the complexity so that we can see what's revealed through that.
I mean, I think it's almost like I'm going to look after myself, but I'm also going to look after other people. So, yeah, I see what you mean about the binary. And, I think what emerged was after the panic response, which was about being afraid and feeling out of control, which is very normal in a pandemic. You then started to see things in neighbourhoods that were very, really lovely. Like people in my one friend's neighbourhood in Collingwood, when at the height of the toilet paper panic buying, outside each house, someone in the middle of the night left a roll on each doorstep. And it's probably someone who went out and hoarded and realised, oh God, I'm
a dickhead.
200 rolls. So, there is this, there's good and bad.
I mean, it is really, when you look at, of all the countries in the world, the one that's had the most catastrophic results out of this is the United States, right? I mean, like their numbers are in a different scale. Even though they've got a big population, there is no cutting the fact that their response has failed, and that failure has led to, more than 100,000 deaths and counting. And I wonder what role a kind of culture which has been built, from the start, has had the notion of individual freedom baked in to its culture from the start. What role that kind of staunch individualism has had in forming their cultural response. What do you think?
Yeah, look, I think you're right, but I also think that you can't ignore the fact that it is built on individualism, but also on stark inequality. The the wealth of America was built on the back of exploitation. The foundation of America as a Western nation was also built on religious fundamentalism. So, I think, which one do we choose? Which one do we choose as the variable that has affected the response in America? Which one is more important?
And I think looking at the UK as well is really interesting because they're kind of half, like austerity really robbed them of a lot of the social fabric and a lot of the systems that would have kept that country a lot more robust during the pandemic. But you still have this great love of the NHS and this great love of the health system, but you haven't had the government investment or the will, and also you don't have social capital there at the moment because of Brexit. So you've had, a number of quite serious injuries to the body of the UK, and then you've had the pandemic, and the body just hasn't been able to, reconnect to fight it. Whereas, as you were saying, Monty, Australia has had a series of quite severe natural disasters where communities have banded together. I mean, I think the real test for us will be climate change, and also, responses to, rates of Indigenous incarceration and deaths in custody. So obviously Australia is definitely not perfect, but we haven't had that 10 years of real fracturing that the US and UK have.
I think, and while we're in the UK, I think it's been so interesting to see the response to Dominic Cummings and his jaunt up north, and that felt like such a moment in British politics, and such a uniting moment. Because why do you think the response in the UK and around the world was so extreme?
Just so cynical. It's just that here is a guy who, was the architect of some of the kind of most divisive messages in Brexit, and was also responsible for the government's messaging around COVID.
And social responsibility.
And social responsibility, but could not, couldn't play by his own rules. And also in that press conference in the Rose Garden, was very kind of unapologetic. And it's this sense of one rule for the commoners, and, he's an elite. And if he wants to go and see his parents in Durham and then weirdly go for a drive to test his eyesight, no one was buying it.
And this is where we have to situate that the statement of what is the cultural milieu that facilitates or enables such a, let's be honest, such an awful response to COVID. And I don't think that we can absolve or excuse the role of leadership in this. Would the response have been different if Obama was in office, for example?
When you mean the response, do you mean, one can assume that the policy response would be different, but do you mean the citizen response as well?
Absolutely. I think that the citizen response, we can definitely see how divisive language, how divisive policies, how divisive reactions have not helped. By virtue of the fact that we had armed militia in the government protesting lockdown, and there was almost like a harm minimisation approach to the way that was dealt with by the police. And yet, a similar situation happens in response to black deaths at the hands of police. And there is no harm minimisation there at all.
They actually go into lockdown because of that, when they probably should have gone into lockdown, in March.
So people who've been prepping for years, who can sit in their bunkers for 18 months, have decided all of a sudden that a couple of weeks they need to have a haircut.
Yeah. If you didn't laugh, you cry. But the leadership's been crucial with, say, someone like Angela Merkel, who's trained as a scientist, and gave a mixture of kind of compassionate and highly sensible and information-rich broadcasts, and it's meant that Germany has, at this point, got out of it fairly well. And the other kind of public messaging which I thought was really effective was the Queen, bizarrely. I'm no royalist, but she did something that Boris Johnson and even Scott Morrison didn't do, which was to acknowledge the emotional costs of isolation, and that we won't know when we see our friends again. And it's hard, but we have been there before, and she's been there before in World War II, and we will meet again. And that was that message came at a time where I think, there was a lot of loneliness in the collective. And that's something that maybe a lot of the male politicians didn't necessarily tap into, whereas Jacinda Ardern and Merkel and the Queen were able to connect with the emotional toll the pandemic was taking.
I mean, there was this sort of real sense in isolation of being part of a collective as well, that kind of paradox that while you were sitting there, in your own little bubble, you were one of millions of little bubbles that were all around the world going through the same thing in kind of different ways. And I imagine that that's probably led to a lot of people thinking about, their lives and their kind of character perhaps. Or do you think that there is the possibility for us to have really become better people as a result of this?
I think different people. I don't know if we'll become better people, because I think being better is a lifelong project. I live in a small town in country Victoria, and one of the taxi drivers there the other day was describing it as an enchantment. He said, our enchantment is almost over. And I asked him what he meant by that, and he talked about it as a pause, almost like a fairy tale thing where everything stopped. And there's so few times in life where there is that big pause, and people started sleeping more. Like, there's all this data that's come out of the US about electricity usage really not firing up until about 9 a.m, which is when people have been getting up and putting the kettle on, whereas it was 6 a.m. And so people are sleeping more, and they're reporting their dreams are being more vivid, and they're spending more time alone. And that's churning up, I think, in each person a kind of individual reckoning or mini revolution or existential crisis that I think is quite profound.
Yeah, I think it is this idea of an existential crisis that always offers us that opportunity for growth and change. I mean, it has to give us an opportunity for change, right? And I love the point that not all change is better, but that difference is really, really important. And through embracing that change, we have an opportunity for transformation. The question is, how is that transformation going to be authored? I think one of the big things that I was struggling with was, was my privilege, acknowledging that I was in a very privileged position. I could really enjoy the isolation experience. And whilst we are experiencing this existential crisis on a global level, I don't think it's fair to say that everybody experienced it in the same way, or everybody experienced this sense that their freedoms had been taken away, that life was in disarray, that life was in turmoil. There are people that live like that all the time, and we don't have to go very far to see them. I think there was this wonderful article written by a friend of mine, Lisa Wynn. She's a medical anthropologist, and she played on that meme, the idea that this virus is Schrodinger's virus, that we have to exist as if we simultaneously have it and don't have it. We have to exist as if we have it so that we don't infect people. We have to exist as though we don't have it, because if we don't have it, then we're not immune, and if we're not immune, there's the potential that we'll get it. But also, if we don't have it, we can go out and do stuff. And so the invisibility of this disease has been what's made it so surreal. But it's even more surreal by the fact that certain sectors of the population have been rendered invisible in this narrative. We have all the celebrities talking about, their terrible isolation with their pools and their
well, that didn't go down so well, let's be fair.
Yeah, everyone hates those guys.
We hate those guys.
But that invisibility is so important because it's affected the kinds of the way that we visualise it. Like, we've got that picture of the disease, but because in general it is so invisible, we don't know how to act. It's affected the way that we hold our bodies, the way that we comport ourselves, the way that we interact with each other. But it's also created an opportunity for us to construct an enemy or construct a visible thing that we can focus on in order to direct our fears, our anxieties, our aggression.
Yeah, the dirty people who are unwashed, who aren't sanitised, who aren't kind of, they're the danger now, aren't they?
And when we think about this question of self and community, it comes back down to, well, what community are we talking about?
Yeah.
Is it an inclusive community, or is it just the ones that look and act and seem a bit like us?
Well, I think a lot of those things will reveal themselves as we come out of isolation. Like I've just noticed in my own friendship groups, I go to hug an old friend, probably not meant to. Some people are comfortable with that. Some people really don't want that. And I'm having conversations where people have said, I've never liked hugging, and this has been a joy because I don't have to touch people in that way that was becoming like the new handshake was like this hug. And so people are kind of redefining
their own boundaries?
Their own boundaries. And also, it's been a great time. I'm not an introvert, sadly, so I didn't enjoy ISO. But it's been a great time for introverts because it's given them permission to just to nest with their families or by themselves, and they don't have to go out 5 times a week.
Look, at the same time as this sort of these kind of personal or small group experiences of this, there's also been another big element in this whole period, which is the fact that we have been required to give up freedoms, and we have allowed ourselves to be surveilled in a way that we don't normally, or certainly, those of us, in privileged positions aren't normally asked to do. And I just wonder what you think, Monty, about the ethics surrounding that. How far is it reasonable to ask us to allow the state to look at our lives and encroach into our lives in this sort of way? And how far is it like, sorry, I don't like this app at all, and this is the first step of something quite dangerous? What do you think?
I mean, the simple reality is that we are always embroiled in a relationship with the state. The question is that relationship healthy, or is that relationship, deeply problematic? And I am a scientist, right? And I looked at the science, and the science was pretty clear. There were some things we needed to do in order to stem the spread of this disease, right? And they were you could count them on a hand and a bit, right? So it was surveillance, it was contact tracing, it was isolation, it was distance, it was clear, consistent messaging, good leadership, cleanliness. Right? Simple things. And simple things that, from my position, were absolutely easy to enact. And I did enjoy a bit of isolation. I really enjoyed the rest. I got off the hustle for a bit. I had an opportunity to think about things. It was a lovely privilege to be able to do that. What I also know, though, is that those same words of isolation, of surveillance, of contact tracing, of mandatory and increased testing, that's the other thing that's really important. That those words themselves hold a symbolic value that isn't the same for me as it would be for an Indigenous community, for example. That the language itself of those techniques of measurement, categorisation, census and control have a deep traumatic history with regards to their relationship to the state, and we need to be mindful of that. Having said that, I also know that, we have learnt a lot from the lessons and the mistakes that we made during the swine flu, especially with regards to Indigenous populations. And so, they were the things that were featuring in the way that we were responding. And we got incredibly lucky. There were so many variables in our favour. We're an island. We have a small population. We're able to close things off really quickly. Even though there are porous boundaries, we're able to close things off. And our Indigenous communities who were the most vulnerable were generally protected from the virus. But in preparing for a potential outbreak, there were a number of things that we had to do. And the first thing we had to do was check our privilege, was to check the language that we were using, to explore collaborative, inclusive mechanisms through which self-determination was at the key. Right, and what was great is, and I was talking to Tess Lee, another wonderful medical anthropologist who did a lot of work, has done a lot of work in the Northern Territory, So it's like, what do we do? What do we do? And her response was pretty simple. It was like, well, we know what the science is. You know, we know what we're supposed to do. We're in a very fortunate position right now where we can actually do something incredibly proactive and productive. And her response was, well, let's have a public health response and a social justice response to set ourselves up to deal with a pandemic crisis. So build the infrastructure, increase the housing, increase the technical knowledge to say to remote communities, this is what we can offer you. What do you want? Where do you want it? And having that inclusive voice is, I think, so important.
Brigid, the other thing that that surveillance and control lends itself to is sort of theories about what might be behind all of this. And you wrote an article very recently about conspiracy theories and the way that conspiracy theories have proliferated over this period. I mean, why do you think that this particular, virus and responses, what is it that's left such fertile ground for people to don their tinfoil hats and
It's really blown up. I think pretty much everyone I know has come across on one of their social media feeds or a relative or a friend saying, the virus isn't all what it seems. There are dark forces at work. And I did a book on the wellness industry, so I'm still subscribing to a lot of podcasts, and my Instagram feed still has a lot of wellness influencers on it. And as of about probably April, I started seeing a real thread of conspiracy running through a lot of these people who previously had advised on, doing best yoga positions for bad backs and uses for turmeric. And they were starting to talk about Bill Gates, 5G, Obamagate. I mean, Pete Evans is someone who's been kind of most prominent in pushing out these messages that traditionally have been more kind of alt-right conspiracy theorists. So I wrote a piece for The Guardian on Friday about this weird collision between the wellness industry and the alt-right. And there's I guess several overlaps, including this notion of purity, if you have a pure body and if you look after yourself, then you shouldn't need to worry about the virus. And we're all being controlled by the government in order to save a couple of 195-year-olds. And so they see the response as being overblown and also a cover in order to have this kind of bring in totalitarian sort of social controls. So freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, freedom of association, a program of mass vaccinations. So there are all these measures that have happened very quickly that if you don't believe that they're for the collective good, if you believe that they're for insidious purposes, then you're going to try and organise around that. You're going to have a 5G protest. You're going to refuse to vaccinate. You're going to try and activate your community to believe that we're under attack. And 1 in 5 young Australians polled recently believed in the Bill Gates 5G conspiracy. So I don't know if it's a fringe thing anymore. I think it's becoming more mainstream.
Well, I mean, what's his name? Peter Evans. Pete Evans has been given platforms on mainstream media all over the place. So,
I've been using that emoji a lot where I slap my forehead. It's funny though, the strange bedfellows of the alt-right and the wellness and the new age ideology is quite interesting. Hans Bayer, who again is another medical anthropologist, talks about the diminutive medical system. Says that medicine is unequally distributed. That you have biomedicine at the top; it's considered the best. You've got heterodox systems, and at the bottom you've got folk medical systems. Generally, those folk medical systems are the ones that are used by generally Indigenous marginalised women, essentially.
Herbalists.
But they're using it because they don't have a choice. They generally don't have access to high-level biomedicine, and when they do, it's usually enacted as a form of governmentality, social control, and it tends to further marginalise those populations. The difference with the wellness new age thing is that they've often co-opted those marginalised Indigenous perspectives, and it's again a function of their access to pluralism within the medical marketplace. Again, an indication of the fact that they have agency and the people they're claiming to draw their philosophical perspectives from don't. that agency is inequitably distributed again.
I mean, it also sort of speaks, and the wellness industry generally speaks to our kind of love of ritual as well, you know, I mean, which is something that you've done a lot of research about, Monty. I mean, how do you think that sort of impulse, which is human and perhaps being lost a little bit, how do you think that can be reconfigured in the light of everything that we're going through at the moment?
Look, I don't think it has been lost. I think that one of the things that is a marker of a dominant society is that the aspects of our culture are rendered invisible because they are dominant. Yeah, we do have culture, we do have rituals, we do have practices. We just maybe aren't aware of them because they're so much part of our enculturated. I think when it comes to ritual, a big part of ritual, and we're seeing it in the play out of this disorienting dilemma, this kind of existential crisis that occurs. One of the things that happens in that moment where things are thrown into disarray, generally in rites of passage, it's where the status quo is disrupted. And in order to manage that disruption, we come together to find meaning or create meaning, potentially from an existentialist perspective. And so what happens is we get this moment where it's like, holy crap, something's happened. What's just happened? And we get this moment of alienation of like, oh my gosh, I feel so awful, right? I don't mean to be patronising. But then what happens is that we try to reconcile that cognitive dissonance that's created through a communal act of sense-making, which is precisely what's happening with us at the moment. And it's in the relating of that discontent with others, and it's about the asking and the inquiring about, you know, what does it mean for you? This is what it means for me, that we can start to put together or reconstitute a sense of who we are in this world and who we want to be as we move forward.
And I think that the interesting thing with ritual is, I mean, just like sort of massive social policy was remade overnight, ritual had to remake itself. Like, I mean, the kind of central tenets of a, you know, say a Catholic mass, communion, the sign of the peace, the collection plate, all banned under social distancing. So you couldn't take communion in the usual way. You couldn't shake hands with your fellow parishioner. So those rituals, you know, had to fall away. Friday night football ritual, you know, that's gone. But in its place, like my brother moved in with me during the isolation, and we had these Friday nights that almost felt like we were back in childhood. You know, it would be takeaway, we get fish and chips or whatever, and then we'd play trivia with a group of friends on Zoom, or play cards, or play Uno. So that Friday night ritual happened all throughout the pandemic, and I think we need ritual in order to have rhythm. And whilst the pandemic destroyed some rituals, you know, you ended up creating a whole heap of new ones, which were very lovely.
And I think this is the important thing. First of all, no culture is static. You know, culture is constantly changing. Rituals have come from somewhere, they're going to change and become something else. What we know is that our tendency towards ritual increases in these moments of crisis because it gives us something repetitive and structured that helps us to feel safe and in a time when things are so confusing and complex, right? It gives us an aspect of predictability that is incredibly reassuring, not just on a social, cultural level, but on a deeply emotional and embodied level. And so this is the beautiful thing, is that we could get rid of some of those rituals that were just about orthodoxy and start to allow rituals to emerge out of praxis, out of the lived experience of crisis, of shared crisis. And that's how we were able to start having the conversations of what does it mean? Who am I? Who do I want to be?
So, Monty, what does it mean? Who are you? And what does it all mean?
I don't bloody know. And that's okay. I think this is the thing. And I'd love to hear your ideas about this, especially from that Stoic perspective, because, you know, I think one of the things that people did immediately was, and we saw it in the social feeds, right? And we keep seeing it in the social feeds, was reacting in order to say, this is what it means, this is what it's all about, this is what's happening. And that reaction was starting to shape the narrative But things were happening so quickly and the changes were happening so profoundly that those narratives didn't last. And so I think we were talking before, like that reaction, that reactive way of going, well, this is who I am, doubling down on whether it be male identity or white identity or middle-class identity or left or right-wing identity, doubling down on that to give us a sense of security and stability in a moment of crisis. I think that was problematic. I mean, I can understand it. I can totally understand it. But what's happened is that it's opened up an opportunity to sit with the complexity and to not have to have those answers straight away. I think we still have a long way to go. So, perhaps we can embrace the possibility that there is not going to be closure. This is incredibly disruptive. That perhaps we're not going to have resolution. From a Stoic perspective, I'm interested in how would the Stoics deal with that moment of disruption and confusion and disarray.
Well, I think it reminds me of that kind of Leonard Cohen lyric, which is great there is a great Stoic, Zen Buddhist, but there is a crack in everything, and that's where the light gets in. And I think when you're saying that this is just the beginning, I think this is the crack, and why this has been such an illuminating time on so many levels is because it's allowed light to get in, and that light has shone on inequalities. Like, why is it that people of colour are more likely to get sick? Why are our most essential workers some of the lowest paid and least appreciated? Who's going to look after, who's keeping an eye on people that live alone or people in care homes? So the pandemic has allowed some light in, which on a personal level, like, how am I in a crisis? How am I reacting? Am I fearful and anxious, or am I open and accepting? So people have had their personal reckonings, but there's also been this societal reckoning and a global reckoning. So it's a lot to deal with, and it's fascinating, and we'll be studying this time for years. But I guess, Monty, just to bring it back to your thing about the Stoics, they lived through plagues, and they lived through both Seneca and Marcus lost children at really young, that were young, and Seneca was exiled for years, and Epictetus was a slave. So they lived in these times where there was no way you'd have a long period of time in the sun and prosperity like we've had in Australia for the last 27 or 28 years, or however long it's been. They expected turmoil and they expected plagues. And so they adjusted accordingly, which is to say, well, what can I control in this situation?
Yeah.
I can only control my response, and I can control how I treat other people. But I can't control you. I can't control you. I can't control, the person that buys, all the toilet paper.
So if you could get one thing out of this, either for yourself or for society more broadly, what would you hope that this period might shift? I mean, I think it's probably a pause more than a complete reset. And thinking of it as a reset's probably a little optimistic, but or pessimistic, depending on your perspective. But what would you hope we get out of this?
I mean, I do have to respond to Brigid's comment. The reality is that the Stoics in their time, they were faced with this disruption every day. And there are people every day who are facing this disruption. The only thing that is different is that it's been brought into our lives. So right now, when we're thinking about questions of individual and community, we do have a moment as a privileged population to make a choice. I can't help but think that, and when I look at the variables that have contributed to where we are today, I can't help but think that there is this massive irony in the fact that if we looked after the social and the environmental injustice in the world, we wouldn't be in quite the same position. We certainly wouldn't have to deal with the situation with such extreme measures. And so I suppose my question or my hope is that if this, the light is being shined in through the crack and we have this opportunity from a position of privilege to make some choices and to put ourselves on a path, what path do we want to go on? Whose path are we serving? Who's going to create that path? Who's going to be disadvantaged by the choices we make? Who's going to be advantaged by it? What voices can we include in that conversation so that we can embrace the complexity?
Brigid?
I think the pandemic has shown that we can move quickly to make the world more equitable.
There are fewer excuses now, aren't there?
Yeah. We changed the world. We shut down the Grand Prix on the day of the Grand Prix, and when that happened, my jaw hit the floor, and I thought, okay, if Daniel Andrews is doing this,
we can do
anything.
Well, on that note, thank you both so much for being here. There's a lot still to unfold. Things are unfolding this weekend all the time. It'll be so interesting to see where this takes us. But I certainly hope, I'm certainly looking forward to hearing your thinking about it as it progresses. And thank you so much for joining us for this conversation about the ethics of a pandemic and 2020. What a year. We'll see you next time here in the Joe Sutherland Theatre. Thank you so much.